Hello, everyone, and welcome from London. So my name is Maria Logan, and I'm the trustee of the UK charity, the Future of Russia Foundation, and I have the honor of introducing today's event, which is part of a series, Future of Russia series, which my foundation supports in collaboration with the Atlantic Council. Today's event is largely based on the report, which was prepared by distinguished Ambassador Daniel Fried and Ambassador Alexander Vershbow. And the name of the report is Russia in the World and How the West Should Deal with It. It can be more timely as we see how the new administration is appointing new key people on foreign policy. So Ambassador John Herbst, who is the director of the Eurasia Center at the Atlantic Council, the floor is yours, and I know you're going to present this wonderful report. Thank you.
Maria, thank you very much, and thank you to the Future of Russia Foundation for support of this work. We have a terrific event for you today. Dan Fried and Sandy Vershbow will present a report. The report, as Maria described, and Celeste Wallander will offer observations. Both are distinguished diplomats. Dan was ambassador to Poland. He was the Assistant Secretary of State for European Affairs. Sandy Vershbow had so many positions, it's hard to remember them. I'll just mention here he was ambassador in Moscow. He was also the Deputy Secretary General of NATO and an Assistant Secretary of Defense. Celeste Wallander was the Senior Director at the NSC for Eurasia under President Obama and also a Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense. And just to boggle all of you with a little bit of math, between Dan, Sandy, and me, we have 150 years of watching Russian foreign policy. Celeste, a little bit younger than us, adds another 35. So you will gain from here knowledge of 185 years of watching Kremlin policy. And with that, I turn this over to, Dan and Sandy to present the report.
Thank you, John. I think I'm supposed to go first, so I will. There's a cadre of American Russian specialists and European Russian specialists who advise us all that we must deal with Russia as it is, and that Russia can never be much better than it is today. And that is difficult advice to accept at face value because Russia as it is pretty bad news. It's an authoritarian kleptocracy at home that uses political murder and authoritarian techniques to stay in power. And political murder or attempted murder, as in the Navalny attempted assassination, and resorts to war and intimidation to subjugate its neighbors, plus attacks democracies in Europe and the United States. Now, that is not a very good basis for sustainable relations, but there's a cadre of Russia experts that tell us that's basically our fault. The United States and the West have alienated Russia. And therefore, the conclusion goes, accommodation with Putin's Russia is our responsibility. And that common standards, common values, common standards of behavior for Russia are simply not applicable. Now, this I am oversimplifying, but not by much. And I think you all know the kinds of articles I'm referring to. That set of assumptions does not match the reality of the past 40 years in which Sandy Vershbow and I have been involved one way or another in Russia policy, back when we were junior diplomats in the Soviet Union, in Brezhnev's time. Now remember, Brezhnev was regarded as the final culminating state of Soviet history, and his system was regarded as eternal. And we were told that after Brezhnev, it could get only worse. And we needed to accommodate ourselves to the reality of Brezhnev's Soviet Union. Well, that isn't at all what happened. Brezhnev's Soviet Union was decaying, and its hostility to the West was not sustainable. And instead of something worse after Brezhnev, following a post-Brezhnev interregnum, we got Gorbachev and we got Yeltsin, who tried to move Russia in a very different direction. Accommodation with the West and a rebuilding at home. In our paper, we recall this era, which needs recalling because many in the West simply swallow without critical comment the Putin's team's characterization of the 90s as nothing but chaos. It was and ended that way, but not at the beginning. And our paper recalls how far we got with Russia and how much we succeeded in doing. There is mythology which sort of recalls the mythology of Versailles, that somehow Hitler was the West's fault because the Versailles Treaty was too nasty to Germany. There is a mythology that the West and the United States were similarly nasty to post-Soviet Russia. Not at all to the case. Sandy and I detail how much the Clinton administration, and then again, the Bush administration with early Putin, reached out to Russia, how much we built them into, not excluded them from, what we hoped would be an emerging international structure. Sandy had to do with a lot of that on the ground at NATO as DCM. He was one of the architects of the NATO-Russia relationship, devised in happier days. So what's the problem? What went wrong and why? And our paper posits that what went wrong is in fact not our fault. It is a dilemma of bad Russian policies over many years, which is Russian authoritarianism keeps the Russian economy weak and Russia weak. And to compensate for that weakness, Russian leaders have had to be aggressive, both against against countries on their border to maintain control and against Western ideas of democracy. And as we point out, this is common to the Soviets. Kennan made that a central thesis of his famous long telegram from Moscow. And it was common to czars like Nicholas I, who used the Russian army to keep dangerous liberal ideas far from Russia. Gorbachev tried to break this cycle. Yeltsin tried to break this cycle. They failed, and we try to account for that failure. And one of the reasons for that failure was the enormous political trauma of the collapse, not merely of the Soviet Union, but really of the Russian Empire as it had existed from the mid-17th century. That trauma weighed on Yeltsin. And as his health declined, so did the reforms in Russia, which might have turned the place around. Are we doomed to Putinism and an endless cycle of hostility? Not necessarily. Not necessarily. Not in the paper, but recently, some of us involved in this meeting were fascinated by an article in Moscow Times by the Russian Americanist Vladimir Frolov, who argues that Russia has overextended itself and that betting all on Donald Trump was a bad bet with Biden coming in. And he argues strikingly, his words, not mine, for a new Brest-Litovsk, which is a major, was Lenin's tactical withdrawal in the face of German superiority, the better to save his and rebuild his country at home. The fact that someone is willing to make that analogy suggests that they know Russia is overextended and are prepared to think about a better future, not because the West tries to accommodate itself to Putinism, throwing out its values and interests, but because Russia attempts to do, under perhaps more favorable circumstances than Gorbachev and Yeltsin had, attempts to recalibrate its own relationship with its own people and with the West. Now, there's a lot, I've jumped through a lot, but the paper tries to look at history, and then the second part deals with policy prescriptions, and for that and for more, I turn to my colleague and co-author and friend since graduate school, Sandy Vershbow.
Thanks very much, Dan. And first, let me say it's been a great experience to work with Dan on this report that we're launching today. And let me thank Maria Logan and the Future Russia Foundation for their support for the project. Our report is a policy memo with a touch of personal memoir. Dan and I have indeed been plowing this field for a long time. We joined the Foreign Service at the start of the Carter administration. And as he said, we served in Brezhnev, Soviet Union. Dan was in Leningrad. I was in Moscow. And our closest collaboration was some years later when we were both senior directors on the NSC during the Clinton administration and worked on the strategy for NATO enlargement and the NATO-Russia partnership. That was an optimistic time when we and the Russians were in many ways speaking the same language about democratic values, human rights, the rule of law, and the sovereignty of all European states. Our mutual goal was with Moscow was to build an all-European security system based on these principles with Russia as an integral part. So a transformed NATO open to new members and a NATO-Russia strategic partnership, which we sometimes called an alliance, small a with the alliance, big A, were the two main pillars. Now, as our report describes, the partnership produced some positive results, but it ultimately foundered for a variety of reasons, and Dan has covered some of them. The Watershed Event was the color revolutions, especially the Orange Revolution in Ukraine in 2004, which brought to the fore the main fault line in relations today, namely Putin's insistence on a free hand to dominate Russia's neighbors and to suppress democracy and human rights at home. I was ambassador in Moscow at the time, and I remember the fury after the Orange Revolution when Putin accused the United States of stealing Ukraine from Russia. And he stepped up his efforts after that to undermine democratic forces throughout the former Soviet space for fear that they would infect Russia with pro-Western ideas. From that point on, Putin's been convinced that the West doesn't really want partnership, but regime change, and seeks to marginalize Russia on the global stage. That's a big reason why the resets under Bush and Obama ultimately failed and why relations haven't fared much better under Donald Trump. Now, our report was commissioned around the time of the publication of the joint letter on the need to rethink our Russia policy, signed by over 100 former colleagues and friends. And there's a lot of things in that letter with which we agree. The current relationship is certainly as bad as it's been since the height of the Cold War, maybe even worse. And there are fewer and fewer guardrails to manage the competition and prevent incidents from escalating to the level of military conflict. But as Dan said, we don't accept that it's only our responsibility for where we've come or to get us out of this hole. We also agree with the open letter's stress on the need to talk to Moscow, if only to seek ways to reduce the risks and stabilize the relationship. In fact, dialogue may be all the more important when relations are so bad. But we do have some doubts, as Dan said, about the argument that we have to deal with Russia as it is. We don't agree that history is destiny. One of our recommendations is don't buy into cliches about Russia. For example, that Russians are preordained or genetically coded to live forever under authoritarian rule. In the late 80s and the 90s, we saw the emergence of a genuine movement for democracy and freedom in Russia, in which the dissidents that Dan and I used to meet furtively back in the late 70s went mainstream. And it was all the more remarkable that the biggest impulse for reform and democratization came initially from within the ranks of the Communist Party itself. Now, that first experiment didn't succeed for a variety of reasons, which we touch on in the report. And certainly Putin and the Siloviki never bought into Western values. And I was witness as ambassador to the beginning of Putin's systematic efforts to suppress democracy, to crack down on independent media and civil society, and to take regime opponents off the playing field, either by arresting them or in some cases poisoning them. But recent events from Khabarovsk to Minsk are signs of a certain restiveness for change in Russia and neighboring countries that may well grow stronger in the coming years, despite Putin's efforts to contain it. And that's why the bottom line of our paper is that, yes, we need to deal with today's Russia as it is, but we should also invest in a future relationship with a better Russia that may be more interested than Putin and his cronies in constructive relations with the West. The paper presents a framework for how to deal with today's Russia in the form of a set of do's and don'ts some of which I've already mentioned. The first points are don't be in a hurry, don't seek a grand bargain with Putin, certainly not at the expense of our principles, and don't sacrifice other countries on the altar of better relations with Moscow. What we should do is to resist Russian aggression in every domain by, among other things, strengthening NATO, hardening our societies against political interference and cyber threats, and by helping Ukraine, Georgia, and now Belarus to defend their sovereignty. We need to raise the costs for Russian aggressive behavior to the point that we can retake the initiative and begin to change Putin's calculus. But as we push back, we also need to stabilize the relationship through dialogue, through arms control. There may still be a few areas where we can find common ground with Russia, such as non-proliferation, counterterrorism, slowing climate change, dealing with future pandemics. But in saying all this, we also know there's no quick fixes. One of our conclusions is we need to be patient and firm in our principles. Putin may be in power for another 10 or 16 years or maybe more, and he may choose to maintain political control by perpetuating the narrative of a hostile West, determined to weaken Russia and deny it its rightful place in the world. So stabilizing the relationship may be the most we can achieve in the near and the medium term. But we shouldn't be passive or fatalistic. We recommend that while we engage with Russian leaders and officials, we also reach out more to Russian society, especially the new generation. Putin may be making it more difficult by branding opposition leaders and civil society as foreign agents. So we should think of new ways to bring more young Russian citizens to the US and Europe, and we should fight back in the information space, setting the record straight on what are the West's intentions. So we hope the guidelines in our paper will be a useful input for the incoming administration, and I hope it will also be the basis for a review of transatlantic strategy towards Russia that I hope will be undertaken with our NATO and EU partners, because the report underscores that working with Europe, our most reliable partner, and building a united front of democracies is the best way to convince Russia sooner or later to end its hostility and return to a more constructive relationship. Thanks.
Hey, Sandy and Dan, thank you. That was wonderful. Celeste, you'll have an opportunity now to comment on their findings.
Great. Thank you very much, Ambassador Herbst. Thank you to the Atlantic Council for inviting me to participate in this discussion and to offer some thoughts on the paper. I would highlight, first and foremost, I think the value of the paper is its careful and detailed history of US-Russia relations in the late Cold War and the transition up until the current times. I know Sandy and Dan characterize themselves as practitioners and diplomats, and that's of course, and leaders, and that's of course true. But what really shines in this paper is their scholarly capabilities, their analytical capabilities. Yes, they lived this, so they can bring that perspective, but they also carefully go through the turn of events, not in sort of at the length of a long history book, but in sufficient detail to make clear what the causal effects were throughout this period that created the opportunity for a Russia that would be modern, liberal, integrated, because of the aspirations of its leadership and its society at the time in the late 1980s and 1990s. And that the course that proved to veer Russia away from that path is focused on the internal politics and the rise of what we now call Putinism. And I think that along with another really terrific study this year that was published in International Politics by Professor Kim Martin, really shows that the simplistic argument that it's NATO enlargement that drove Russia to where it is today is baseless. It doesn't match with the facts. And in fact, it's very clear that while NATO enlargement has contributed to the narrative in Russia of grievance and of external threat. The timing of Russia's cooperation with NATO through the course of the 90s and even up until through the Obama administration during the first term does not support that very simplistic and incorrect analysis. The report makes clear that the core threat to Putinism in Russia, not to Russia, but the threat to Putinism is liberalism, both political and economic, and integration in a global liberal order where transparency, competition, and the regular pull and push of politics and economics shapes foreign policy. That's not consistent with how Putinism runs inside the country, and that's the core. And I'm using my own terms for explaining this, but I think the report makes that very clear. So the mistakes were, and another value, I think, of the report is that Dan and Sandy do confront some of the mistakes that have been made in US policy towards Russia. I thought particularly illuminating was their self-reflection on the mistaken assumption that, like Central and Eastern European countries, Russia would be able to travel that path towards liberalization and modernization in the 1990s. So it was an error of hope rather than some conspiracy theory and a strategy to weaken Russia. And they point to the important distinction between the role of nationalism in that emergence from communism and socialism in Eastern and Central Europe, which helped to sustain the difficult political period of very painful reforms in countries like Poland, Hungary, and Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. But that wasn't really available in Russian politics because the transition in Russia was about a post-imperial reckoning with Russia's past rather than a growth of nationalism to help sustain the political leadership as it expected a lot from its society. And I thought that was not only historically correct, but really intellectually honest of the authors and really helps us to understand the path and what Russia faces going forward as well, because that nationalism is still not a force for supporting reform, it is a form for supporting Putinism and illiberalism. I have a couple of little quibbles in the interest of intellectual honesty. I just have two quibbles with their analysis. One is that while it is true that United States constructed a cooperation mechanism with Russia in the Partnership for Peace and in multiple efforts which resulted with the NATO-Russia Founding Act in 1997, and even though it is the case, as the authors note, that the door was always open for Russian membership in NATO, I think it's fair when you look back at the historical record, though, there wasn't a concrete, practical, or really clear strategy for Russian membership in NATO. Now, of course, that's first and foremost Russia's responsibility, but I do think that there was a willingness to leave the door open for Russian membership in NATO, but that open door policy was not perceived by Russian foreign policy leadership in the 1990s as an actual practical path to membership. And I spoke with many of them in the 1990s about that. They argued that the open door statements were window dressing, but didn't seriously consider a Russia membership in NATO. And I think that did affect the failure of the Yeltsin leadership in the 1990s. And I think my other slight quibble, and maybe it's not, I'll be interested to hear what the authors say, is that I think that the US and NATO intervention against Serbia to protect Kosovo, to stop the killing of innocent civilians, was a much more signature event in the development of a sense of NATO as a threat. So it wasn't so much the expansion of NATO's membership, but the expansion of its mission in the case of the use of force against Serbia, that really was a turning point in the Russian foreign and security policy elite. Because in the NATO-Russia Founding Act, the United States and the other NATO members had committed to not using force out of area, except with the UN Security Council resolution. And Russia's assumption was therefore it would have veto power over NATO's use of force out of area. So I'm not speaking about the merits of that decision to use force and to prevent what was going on in Kosovo, but I'm simply highlighting that I think that that is tied then to the subsequent narrative in Russia about how NATO is an instrument of threatening Russia and being an element of, as the authors point out, the threat to Russia through color revolutions and regime change. But I want to come back to my main point, which is that the report makes very clear that the challenge we face right now is not, hundreds of years of Russian history, and it's not merely the mistakes that were made by many in the 1990s, but the emergence of a Russian political system that is authoritarian, corrupt, and views the entire project of integration and modernization as a threat to itself at home. So the challenge we face isn't necessarily Russia as it is, as the authors point out, which leads many to the analysis that you therefore have to make a deal with this Russia because it can't change, and a deal that consists of the United States giving up its national interests, its security interests, its values, and its priorities. But in fact, you have a Russia that could evolve in the future back towards a path of reform, integration, and modernization, if its society and if Russians themselves choose that. And that a Russia, that dealing with the Russia that is today is certainly possible because we've dealt with a difficult Russia for decades, but it needs to be a policy of dealing with Russia as it is that puts American interests, values, and priorities first. And that is what, in fact, the multiple presidential leaderships in the United States have sought to do and can continue to do by focusing on dialogue, but a dialogue based not on Russian demands, but on American realities as much as Russian realities. So I have many more points I could make about this terrific study, but I feel that it would be much more useful to get to the discussion. And so let me thank the authors for their terrific study and urge everyone to take it seriously and think long and hard about the implications of this historical document on our next foreign policy towards Russia.
Les, thank you very much. Dan and Sandy, 1 minute each if you want to respond to Celeste's comments.
Her comment about moving faster or with more determination on a potential Russia NATO membership track recalls a story along these lines. So early in the Bush administration, I argued to Condi Rice that we ought to push ahead with this track, at least conceptually. Let the Russians know that their membership in NATO was a possibility. And we had to think about this and what would it take to make this real? She looked skeptical, but I made the case. A couple of weeks later, she calls me into her office. This is early, this is like 2002, good days with Putin. And she said, okay, I raised the idea with Sergei Ivanov. And he told me, we're not interested in NATO membership. We're not interested in joining an organization where we have an equal standing with Latvia, and don't ever ask about this again. And she looked at me and said, okay, happy now? So she shut me up pretty effectively. That's not to say that I disagree with Celeste's point. Clearly, I agreed with it at the time. Maybe had Yeltsin been more successful, this might have gotten farther. But I mention this not to take issue with her point, with which I'm fundamentally in agreement, as that story shows, but to show how it was difficult. Anyway, Sandy probably has similar, or even better, more apropos stories like that.
Well, thanks. First, thanks, Celeste, for your very positive words about the paper and particularly the history portions of that paper. That was a fun part to work together on. As for NATO, I certainly agree with your point that Kosovo was a bigger trauma in the still very young NATO-Russia partnership than we maybe believed at the time, or even have accepted in hindsight, because it was using force against a traditional Russian friend/client, and without the UN Security Council authorization. And while we tried to convince the Russians it was a one-off exception just forced upon us by events, and we did have the fact that the Russians had signed up to many UN Security Council resolutions saying the crisis in Kosovo was a threat to international peace and security, but we didn't perhaps push the diplomatic track long enough to bring the Russians on board. And when we did it again in Iraq, of course, I think that cemented the Russian view. As for NATO membership, I think it was seriously discussed by Clinton and Yeltsin, not in an operational sense, but it never went anywhere from there. And I agree that we need to think, if we ever get back to some kind of civil relationship between NATO and Russia, to think about ways to bring the Russians more closely into the decision making, not a veto, but to have a sense that their partnership with NATO is not just window dressing, not just sort of a consolation prize. And this could perhaps be done in a kind of comprehensive way, looking at also what we do about Ukraine and Georgia's aspirations for membership, where we made a promise that they'd come in, but we haven't figured out how to bring that about. Maybe inventing some kind of new associate member status as a way station for both Ukraine and Georgia and for Russia could be the way of developing a much more inclusive European security system, which we failed to do in the late 90s and the years after that. We could start, as Toria Nuland suggested in her article, maybe going back to even Medvedev's European Security Treaty, not literally, but as a sort of a starting point for discussions on a new European security architecture. But first, the Russians have to start respecting Helsinki principles and get out of Eastern Ukraine. I think that without that, we're stuck, and these sorts of discussions are largely of academic interest.
Thank you. I'm going to ask one question, because then we'll turn to audience questions. People have been submitting them on the Q&A function, and please continue to do so. You folks in your presentation covered many of the questions I wanted to ask, but there's one I think that is relevant. We all lived through Brezhnev's period of stagnation, of zastoy. And some people are talking about a period of stagnation again in Russia, since the Russian economy, even when oil was $100 a barrel in 2012 and 2013, was not growing at more than a couple of percentage points a year. And of course, the GDP has been falling as a result of sanctions and the drop in oil prices. So are we seeing a period of great stagnation, perhaps terminal stagnation? How does this impact Russian foreign policy?
Well, it's Russians that are using the term zastoy to apply
Correct.
this phase of Putinism. So they've answered your question far more authoritatively than I could. Yes, I think it's apt. This does remind me of the Brezhnev period after the invasion of Afghanistan and the wrecking of Jimmy Carter's effort at arms control. It was a bad period. I think there is a growing realization in Moscow that things can't go on the way they have. I also, and this is a point Sandy made that I'm going to double down on, I find it odd and frankly weird that analysts, a school of Russia analysts assumes that Russians are incapable of understanding democracy or representative government or simple justice. Well, what do you say to the people of Khabarovsk? And if this is an kind of orthodox, Russian Orthodox cultural legacy, which is sometimes said to be, which I don't believe at all, what about Belarus, where the people are sustaining pro-democracy demonstrations? They're not Russians, but the Russians regard them as the same people. They are Pravoslavny and Russian and largely Russian-speaking people in Minsk and throughout Belarus. So if democracy is not an alien concept to Belarusians or Ukrainians, why is it considered impossible for Russians? I find that patronizing and reductionist stereotyping.
Dan is frozen. Sandy, do you want to jump in here? But you have to unmute first.
Yeah, just briefly, the facts speak for themselves in terms of the declining living standards, negligible if negative economic growth, all further compounded by the oil price. So yes, I think this Russian stagnation is here to stay because Putin remains resistant to the kinds of reforms that might at least produce some reversal of these trends. And I think it comes at an interesting time when, as this article you or Dan mentioned by Frolov, points to a Russian realization that a lot of their hegemonic policies in the near abroad are not really working that well and are just becoming increasingly costly towards Russia. And there may be a rethink going on their side about the value of pushing so hard to dominate the region, to push their Eurasian Union integration project. Plus, with the change of administration, they may be less able to get a free pass certainly from the White House, and less able to divide Europe, and may fear increased pressure of sanctions, which could add up to readiness to at least lower the temperature, de-escalate, and seek some kind of modus vivendi with the West. We may need to ratchet up the pressure a little longer before that happens, but something is shifting, and the stagnation may be a big part of it.
Celeste, do you have one chance to comment quickly, or?
Sure, very quick. I'll give an example. Of the effects of this stagnation and on foreign policy. I agree with the basic presumption of basic framework of the paper that Russian foreign policy is problematic because of the nature of the political system at home. But I think what we're seeing now is that those constraints at home are leading the leadership to be willing to explore cooperation. For example, on New START treaty. And Russia, during the second term of the Obama administration, Russia had put forward preconditions for extending the New START treaty that now Russia has lifted. It has removed those preconditions. And Putin has put on the table willingness in a next arms control negotiation to talk about Russia's new strategic systems that it's been developing, which previously Russia refused to do that. And I think it shows that there is an opportunity to have the dialogue that many argue we should have, and we should, but to do it in a way that's consistent, that doesn't require caving into Russian positions, but in fact works in the area that Sandy and Dan talked about, being patient, being steady, and focusing on our own interests and values as a guide to that negotiation.
Good point, thank you. Okay, we have a question, and I apologize if I mispronounce the name, from William Janes, a professor at Fordham Law School. He asks about Chinese investments and economic footprint in Europe and elsewhere, and Russia's near abroad. And that says, is the Russia-Chinese relationship frail enough that it can be triangulated? Celeste, you want to give it, you're smiling, you want to give it a shot, and then we'll turn to Sandy?
So I'll just make a quick point observation, which is that when I give a talk about Putinism and Putin foreign policy and how it challenges American interests and what we've seen and created the problems of Ukraine, Syria, and Russian intervention in interference in the American elections. Whenever there are China experts in the audience, when I explain how they see the same framework for explaining Xiism as we've advanced to explain Putinism. So the the quasi, I'm going to call it quasi-realist argument that the United States should be able to peel Putin off of partnership with China ignores the reality that, in fact, China, Putinism and Xiism have a lot in common in their challenge of the global liberal order, of integration, of transparency, competition, and especially American leadership. So yeah, it'd be possible to kind of triangulate Russia and China, but it would not be a strategy consistent with our own interests and our own values and leadership.
Sandy?
Get that mute button. I agree with that. I think that right now Russia is accepting that they're becoming increasingly the junior partner in the relationship with China. And I think they take comfort in the fact that they're still the superior military power, but that gap may close in the coming years. The Chinese don't give the Russians any trouble over their efforts to dominate neighbors in the near abroad or their adventurism in the Middle East. But I think the Russians may begin to get less tolerant of China's increasing influence in Central Asia, in the Middle East, in North Africa, and even in places like Ukraine. I think for now, the Russians still take some comfort in the fact that it's China and not the United States that's mucking around in their backyard. But they may become increasingly sensitive as China begins to sort of take up to the lead over Russia in these sensitive regions, and Russia may therefore be more susceptible to approaches by us to sort of to manage Chinese behavior rather than being quite as indifferent as they are now.
Okay, thank you. Dan, I see you're back. Let me give you a new question. So we have many questions. This is from Steve Ackerman from Congressman Fulcher's office. Does Russia have a grand strategy beyond restoring its influence in its near abroad and destabilizing the Middle East, North Africa, etc.?
I'm not sure they do. I mean, they may write down what their grand strategy is, and there are grand strategic documents that the Russian foreign ministry or presidency produces, but I don't think they have a grand constructive strategy. I think it is a kind of anti-US nihilism, making trouble for the sake of hurting the United States, a sense of vengeance and spite directed against the US and the West in general, plus a real strategy of keeping the countries of the former Soviet Union subordinate to them. Their nightmare would be, a democratic pro-Western, but even just a democratic successful Ukraine or Belarus, because that is inconsistent and incompatible with the survival of Putinism. No, I don't think they have a larger strategy, which distinguishes them from the Chinese, who, after all, get a lot out of the international system. The Chinese have a foot in and a foot out. The Russians don't seem to have a foot in at all. And I think that this kind of a destructive approach is, I think more Russians are recognizing this as a narrowing alley, narrowing and darkening. No, I don't think they have a grand strategy.
Okay, we have a question from Valery Yegisman of Voice of America. Celeste, if you could answer this. How do you expect U.S.-Russian relations to develop under the Biden administration?
I think that you will see a return to the values and interests that in particular underlie or are at the core of the transatlantic relationship. the commitment to liberalism in both our own domestic politics, but also in our foreign policy, in the definition of our national interests. You will see a willingness to certainly extend dialogue both with the Russian government and with Russian society. One of the other elements of the paper that I think is so strong is it makes the point that dealing with a Russia as it is now means not being restricted to only official discussions and negotiations, but keeping people-to-people contacts, extending, education exchanges, or the whole package of our society-to-society relationship. And you'll see more reliance and coordination with the Transatlantic Alliance and coping with Russia. So it will be a stronger foreign policy because it won't be, America alone. It'll be, again, America with its European partners. I think that's clear now that it's been announced, or at least discussed publicly, that Anthony Blinken will be the nominee for Secretary of State. He's been very clear on all these elements in a Biden foreign policy, and especially a Russia element of that.
Thank you. Sandy, Valeria also asked about what should happen with open skies and with START negotiations under a Biden administration.
Well, clearly the administration is going to be much more supportive of arms control than the Trump administration. Nowhere to go but up in that regard. And we don't know details of their approach to START beyond extending the agreement at least for a few years to build some space for discussions of a follow-on agreement. But they may actually want to go in a similar direction to the outgoing administration in terms of widening the scope of the next agreement to encompass at least some, if not all, tactical and non-strategic nuclear weapons. And I think it is good news that the Russians seem to have relented, as Celeste mentioned, on fencing off some of their exotic new strategic technologies. The Open Skies Treaty presents a real dilemma because I think the Biden administration would like to stay in the treaty, but the U.S. exit has just become official, and it was done in accordance with the legal requirements of the Open Skies Treaty, even if some congressional consultation was not carried out. So it may be hard to declare that the departure was illegal and declare ourselves back in that treaty. And otherwise, we have to get 2/3 majority in the Senate, which is unlikely. So we may have to think of other forms of confidence-building measures and transparency measures, but I'm pessimistic that the U.S. could go back into open skies, given the delicate balance in the Senate.
Okay, thank you. Tim asked about Russian malign financial influence. How can we stop this? Is it too late? Has Russian dirty KGB money become too embedded in our systems? Dan, I think this one's for you.
Well, I refer immediately to an excellent paper addressing exactly that topic by Anders Ostlund and Julia Friedlander that came out just last week. The Biden administration, Biden's foreign affairs article from earlier this year talks about the need to combat corrupt financial flows. Russia is particularly egregious in that regard. And there are lots of things that we could do, not just sanctions. In fact, the economic tools to dry up channels of corrupt Russian and other forms of corrupt money are not principally sanctions. There are lots of ways to enforce transparency. Why should LLCs registered in Delaware be anonymous? Why shouldn't beneficial owners be made public in real estate deals or major art sales, which have been channels for corrupt Russian and other forms of money? There are a lot of financial statecraft tools, sanctions, transparency, and others, which should be on a common transatlantic agenda. If the US and Europe and London, they got to be part of this, set common standards of transparency, we have a chance of starting to squeeze the Russian flows of corruption, helping countries in Europe and helping ourselves. So that is an area where I expect the Biden administration will work. There's a lot of, as they say, low-hanging fruit. And take a look at my colleague's paper. It's a terrific menu of options that were I coming into the next administration, I'd be grateful to have it at the ready.
Thank you. David Kramer likes your presentation, and he asked, is a better future for the Russian people possible as long as Putin and his associates remain in power? Celeste?
Well, if we just look at the track record of what the Putinist leadership is doing to the country, it seems unlikely. Again, we've pointed to, it's not, the problems of the Russian economy are not low oil prices per se. Actually, high oil prices are a problem for the Russian economy because high oil prices create rents, and rents fuel corruption. But leave that aside for a second. The real problem of Russian living conditions, eroding financial and position of average Russians, the brain drain that's happened over the last couple of years where college-educated Russians are leaving in the hundreds of thousands is because of the failure to create a competitive economy outside of raw material and natural resource extraction. And that is a competitive economy like that is incompatible with the sort of the corruption at the heart, the corruption in the system of political power at the heart of Putinism. That's why you've seen independent, successful business people in Russia expropriated through being targeted by the tax police, having their successful companies acquired by cronies around Putin. This is a story well told, also by Anders Osland and other of his very wonderful reports. So, and that's why Russian elections are not free and fair, because the leadership fears that if Russian citizens have information and a choice and the ability to hold the leadership accountable, they will. So I don't think you need to have somebody like me, an American like me, say that Putinism isn't good for the average Russian. I think the Russian leadership knows that, and that's why it is eliminated effective opposition, independent media, and has managed elections instead of free and fair elections.
Thank you. Chris Krylova asks about Belarus. He says, what other measures is the West considering due to Putin's financial and other support for Lukashenko? But let me make this question broader and give it to Sandy. How does the crisis in Minsk play itself out? You have this extraordinary standoff between increasing repression, but also refusal of the protesters to leave the streets.
Mm-hmm. Well, Putin does clearly face a dilemma. He knows that if he intervenes directly or even endorses an even more sweeping crackdown by Lukashenko, he's going to permanently alienate what was historically a friendly Belarusian people. And I think he's looking for some way to engineer a soft landing for Lukashenko to exit from power, and with opposition more sympathetic to Moscow to organize some kind of transition. But that's not working out. The opposition has been surprisingly firm, despite the brutality that's been used against their weekly demonstrations. So I think this is going to be an interesting challenge, how to engineer some political change, which will inevitably need to be more responsive to the street than Putin is prepared to be, without sort of seeing Belarus go the path of Ukraine and becoming much more supportive of Euro-Atlantic integration and distancing itself from Russia. So I don't think he's found the solution, but I think he is trying to square that circle, but he may not succeed.
Thank you. We've got an interesting question from David Grigorian. He says the following: recent events in the Caucasus clearly go against Frolov's point about Russia having overextended itself in the near abroad. So Dan, this one's for you. Grigorian continues, by forcing Armenia to capitulate and inserting its peacekeepers, in quotes, into the conflict and arguably demonstrating a new level of assertion, if not aggression. How would the author's recommendations about U.S. policy vis-a-vis Russia change if they had the benefit of observing events in the Caucasus while working on their paper? So Dan, I'll give that to you.
That's a really good question. The Russians managed the outbreak of the war with some skill, and they enhanced their position. Now, Turkey is also in a stronger position. I think the United States and France came out as clear losers because we were absent. I don't think that changes our bottom line assessment of Russia playing from essentially a declining position because of its internal economic and political weakness. But that doesn't mean life is complicated. It doesn't mean that they're not going to be able to do anything right or have no successes. I think they have handled this the Nagorno-Karabakh war with a degree of skill, partly because we were absent and distracted, but they've handled this well. It doesn't mean that their problems are not their problems.
Okay, thank you. We have a question which almost cuts against the argument made. I'll give it to Celeste from Christian Forstner. What can we offer to the Putin regime, if not a grand bargain, to make Russia more democratic and less hostile to the West?
So in the end, Russia is going to become pluralistic, hopefully democratic, have a vibrant, competitive, modern economy because Russia's citizens demand it and do it. So I think that's really important to remember, is that historical progress comes because citizens demand it and are capable of attaining that path. And that was true in Central and Eastern Europe. The United States did not bring reform and freedom to Poland. Poles did. So we ought to be modest in our abilities. We've got to be clear in our values, but modest in our abilities. And speaking up for our values, which are, I believe, the values of a vast majority of Russian citizens as well, helps to sustain that possibility in Russia's future. And again, the report really talks about this quite well, that you can this is my term, you can chew gum and walk at the same time. You can do arms control negotiations with the Putin government, and you can sustain people-to-people contacts, you can support education, you can support those Russian citizens who are demanding transparency and the rule of law. You can do both at the same time. So creating the space for Russian citizens to demand that of their own leadership is something that the United States has actually done over the decades and should be doing again.
Okay, thank you. We have lots of questions. I'm going to do two more before we close. So this one follows, Sandy, up on what Celeste was just saying. And the question is from Elizabeth Rood. If the next administration returns to Open Skies Treaty, do you see any hope for overcoming the Russian compliance issues that have precipitated U.S. withdrawal? Now, let's make that more broadly, not just about Open Skies, but about INF and other arms control agreements.
Mm-hmm. I'm not optimistic about that, but because the Russians seem very determined to fence off a few sensitive areas from overflights. But I think if they're looking for a more general climb down from the current confrontational relationship, maybe they'll be a little bit more flexible on that. On INF, there's actually some signs that they realize that they may have overreached when they violated the INF treaty, leaving the U.S. now free to deploy medium-range missiles that could threaten them on short notice. And they've recently kind of updated their moratorium idea to offer some kind of pullback of this offending illegal 9M729 missile. So there may be something to talk about in the context of a follow-on START agreement to kind of reintegrating some limitations on INF systems, at least nuclear armed ones. But I think it's still early days to know about that.
Okay, thank you. And the last question from Nicholas Myers goes to Dan, since Dan, to my great satisfaction, brought up Brest-Litovsk. So Myers asks, what issues would you prioritize asking Russia to concede in a hypothetical 21st century Brest-Litovsk?
Well, it's not so much asking them to concede, but as Sandy has pointed out for a couple of years, the road to a better relationship with Moscow begins with their pullback out of Ukraine. Okay, they have to make a deal that gets them out of the Donbass and restores the eastern Ukrainian border. And no, we're not going to allow them to keep Crimea. Okay, they have to back off. Nobody asked them to invade Ukraine. They did that all on their own. And the issue, by the way, to underscore Celeste's point, NATO enlargement was not on the table for Ukraine. The precipitating fact in 2014 was an association agreement, not membership, an association agreement with the EU that Putin insisted Yanukovych not sign. Hence the demonstration. So back off of Ukraine, cut that deal, and stop, interfering in U.S. and Western elections. Knock it off. But it starts with Ukraine, and don't add additional areas of confrontation. Belarus, the demonstrators, Sandy, I think, said this. The demonstrators in Belarus they're not flying EU flags, they're not flying NATO flags or American flags. They want to run their own country. They want democracy in Belarus for Belarusians. And I'm not interested in doing a deal about Belarus with Russia. The Russians simply have to let the Belarusians work it out.
Okay, thank you. I would like to add the Russians should stop going further into Georgia to that list.
Having lived through the Russo-Georgian War on this side, of the Atlantic, yes.
Okay. I'd like to thank Dan and Sandy for their excellent presentation, Celeste for her wonderful observations, and our large audience for tuning in. And I'd like to thank once again, Maria Logan of the Future of Russia Foundation for their support for this work. And there'll be more work on Russia in the weeks and months to come.